Alright, here's another game in the Albin Counter Gambit. This game is from Riga 1959, and with the white pieces, there was a player named Ilmari Nimela, and with the black pieces, none other than the world champion Boris V. Spassky. Now, he wasn't the champion in 1959. Those of you who know a little bit about chess history know who the champion was in 1959, and that was none other than the magician from Riga, Mikhail Tal. Spassky was to become champion 10 years later, but at this time he was still very strong and is just entering into his prime. Now, this game started off d4 from Nimela, d5 from Spassky, c4, Queen's Gambit, and the infamous Albin Counter Gambit. D takes e5, d4. And I just want to make the point. I've made it before in some older videos, but the great Hall of Fame chess player from the 1920s, Aaron Nimzovich, he gave in his book, his famous book Blockade, which is a little less known than the book My System. But I think the book Blockade, man, is an awesome book to have. If you can get the book Blockade by Nimzovich, it's a small pamphlet. It's about oh, I don't know. Let me see. I'm looking at it right now. It's about 65 pages. But it's very clear and concise. Not as terse as My System. I've never read My System. I've just kind of flipped through it. But Blockade is something else. I mean, this is a book that I use it almost as like a reference book. I mean, I've read it probably 10 times. But it's a great book. And what he says about he says to summarize the fundamental motives of the pawn advance in the center. In other words, why would you advance a pawn in the center of the board? He says A, demobilization of the opponent. What does that mean? Make it hard for the opponent to develop or mobilize. In other words, these moves right now after this move d4 can't be played. And once you understand that, then you understand the reason why d4 is played in the Albin Counter Gambit. Because you might be like, hey, black gives up a pawn, then he wastes more time moving the pawn again to d4 instead of developing. He's moving, in this case, to demobilize the opponent. In other words, make it very difficult for white to get his pieces out to good squares. And while white is busy trying to untangle, black is able to get his pieces out with good development and gain an attacking opportunity on the king side. And in the process, even get his pawn back and then some. Of course, that's black's idea. Now, practice has shown, as I said in my other video on the album, that black just does not quite have enough for the pawn deficit. But in these early days, lines were still being worked out. Practice, had to be, shown over the board. And especially when you have a real strong player versus a weaker player, for instance, Grandmaster versus IM, and they didn't have computers back in the days, and, theory wasn't quickly disseminated. These lines were very dangerous, and even today, the Albin is still a good surprise weapon. But what are the fundamental motives of the pawn advance in the center according to Nimzovich? This is one of them right here. A, demobilization of the opponent. The other one is opening of lines. Sometimes you want to break through and open the E file, open the D file for your rooks. C, restraint through wedge formation. So A and C are kind of related. Restraint through wedge formation. This right here is known as a wedge because it cuts in half the board, the king side and the queen side. And it restrains because, as I said before, it makes it hard to develop the pieces freely. So hang in there. So this game, knight f3. Knight c6 from Spassky, protecting the pawn. A3. Again, this is 1959, so theory started developing a little bit more. If you look at my no-name Lasker game, you can see I think white played e4 at this point. A3 is just simply to stop this idea of bishop b4. E3 is possible, but then bishop b4 is good for black to equalize immediately. Again, same deal here. If e3, bishop b4 is good for black immediately, and there's a trap associated with that, which I showed in my last video. This is why you see lines with g3 and bishop g2 being played. So knight f3, knight c6, a3. Besides keeping this bishop at home, there's ideas of expansion with bishop b4, eventually b5, driving the knight away, knight bd2, and bishop b2. And after this knight goes to b2, then b3, all designed, which is, although technically not an isolated pawn because it does have a neighbor, in the practical world, it is an isolated pawn because the pawn cannot be easily defended by the c pawn. So a3, bishop g4, and again, it's fighting for the existence of this pawn by putting pressure here. Excuse me. Take that away. By putting pressure here, this pawn is protected indirectly. Knight bd2, queen e7, putting pressure on this pawn again to distract the pressure on that pawn. g3 was played. Now h3 is better. So for instance, after h3, say bishop takes, knight takes, there's still pressure here. So if knight takes e5, then queen takes d4 and white remains up a pawn. So g3, and after g3, it's possible to play castle again, preserving this pawn right here and still threatening this one. Spassky played knight takes e5, and notice the threat here of mate, the next move. So for instance, if knight takes d4, then knight d3, mate. Queen takes e5, h3, bishop h5 is played, bishop e6 is good, putting pressure on the c4 pawn, bishop g2, and simply castle. And now we could say that black again is equalized. Black has this, there's no pawn deficit here, and black still has his wedge formation. His pawn is very strong, but black, white has developed around this, and only problem right now is he really can't play e3. But right now he's not planning to do so. But castling could be a little problematic at this point because of the e2 pawn. Interesting move here is f4. I haven't really looked at it too much. It seems a little risky at first because of the backward pawn of the e3. But for instance, f4 hitting the queen, and say queen e7, g4, bishop g6, f5, and trap the bishop. So did Spassky analyze this at home previously? Who knows? It seems that black may have some compensation because in the dark squares are a little suspect. So for example, bishop takes, g takes, and queen h4 check, and this attacking this pawn. So he might have analyzed it, he might have not. It looks like white should be all okay, because white has some counter attacking chances. For instance, queen b3, right? Queen b3, check, king e1, and then you got to stop that mate from happening c6, and rook f1. So that's, to me, that's unclear, because white's king is kind of in the middle of the board, and I wouldn't want to play the white side practically here, but I'm sure some players would. So f4 was an interesting try, but I can understand why this player simply played the natural looking move, knight f3. Queen a5 check from Spassky. Bishop d2. Notice how the bishop coming to d2 blocks the pressure on this pawn. Queen a6. Castle. Spassky could have taken that, but he probably doesn't want to get hit by the rook here, and he continues to develop. Knight f6 and b4. Knight e4, c5, d3, and finally he uses the pawn to what? Remember Nemzovich blockade, one of the three main purposes for advancing in the center. He wants to open up lines, but what happens? Opponent plays e3. However, there's a little pin problem there with that bishop on h5 now, and this pawn is dangerous even though it's blockaded right now. So f5, a4, queen gets out of dodge, rook c1, bishop e7, a5, and now we have a classic attack building up on opposite wings. So white sacrifices a pawn, and it's an interesting move. I mean, it's hard. Like, looking at it, looks pretty, pretty strong for white with this idea, right? But after bishop takes, then what are we doing about this piece right here? This piece is only protected by the knight, so we remove the knight. This hangs. So basically, white's kind of burned his bridges, has to go all out here. Spassky played bishop e8. Now, after this, right? After this, the position becomes very, very sharp. Natural move is just to move the queen out the way. Say queen h5. But this is an interesting move also. Attacking the opponent's queen. So for instance, rook takes here, bishop takes here. And black is just winning. It's pretty difficult to calculate over the board. But Spassky definitely missed the win there. Instead, he plays bishop e8. Knight e5 with more pressure here. c6. But again, he's burning his bridges. And again, Spassky seems to be intimidated by these attacking moves because he doesn't take the bishop. Again, if he takes the bishop, now what? So, I don't know, knight takes c6. Attacking here. And let's say queen d7 just protecting, queen d6 protecting this. Knight a7, king b8. and it starts getting pretty rough here. Check, check. Queen takes b4, and I mean the game gets very, very sharp. The game is very sharp here. So again, uh, commend Nemela, the white pieces, for playing in this manner against an aggressive style player, Spassky. Because Spassky didn't want any parts of it. He played c5 with the discovered attack on the queen here. Excuse me. Let's cancel that. So, queen e2, queen f6, attacking the knight. Bishop takes e4, f takes e4, and what we see now here is basically a nice consolidation by Spassky. So he avoided the sharper tactics, and he maintained his advantage of this wedge formation. And these pawns are going to be killer in the endgame. So Spassky, he probably, saw that he could play a little bit sharper and riskier, but he saw the pawn structure and that realized that at the end of the day, as I gradually trade down and get to the end game, that the game is going to be heavily in my favor. So even here, as he plays queen f5, he could have took this pawn, right? But why enter into unnecessary complications after knight b6 check? Even though in theory he could have moved like queen c4 threatened here and here. So even though in theory that he could have somehow overcame these moves by white. Why enter into such complications? So he played queen f5. B takes c5, queen h3, knight d6, bishop d6, c takes d6, rook takes d6. Right? And queen c4. Nice move by Spassky. Just protecting this pawn, which is more valuable than this one. King is nice and safe. Gives up the exchange. Rook takes rook takes queen b5. And of course the idea is pin him and win him. Spassky just comes back. Queen e6. Rook c1, rook a8, rook c5, and now rook b8. Check, king c8. And this just helps Spassky get to the end even quicker. So king c8. And this is all in consolidation. Queen d1, king g2, and finally queen d2 at the end. After this move right here, for instance, Spassky would have had to be careful. A lot of players would have tried to slip that move in and get this maiden, but after that, you get perpetual check. So even in the winning position, you have to keep your eyes open here. So this is why after queen d1, check, king g2, then he captured. And now there's no perpetual check because the rook is here, d6. So for instance, after queen e8, just simply rook would come back to d8. Okay, so that's that game right there. And you can see the kind of the spirit of the Albin Counter Gambit as it progressed through time, and that was a nice game by Spassky, and again showing the importance and the lethal potential of that wedge formation. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward to 2005, and this is the Ordix Open in Germany. This game is between Igor Kankin, Grandmaster, who's rated 2610 at the time with the white pieces, versus one of my favorite players, Alexander Morozevich, who was 2707 at the time. And he's known for playing some of these obscure uh, so-called romantic openings like Albin Counter Gambit, Shigorin's Defense. And it's always nice to see when you see it played at the top levels. Okay, so this game went d4, d5, c4, e5. We already know, what's going on here. Black gambits a pawn to set up the wedge formation. Knight of 3, knight c6, g3. Now, again, the last game we looked at was a Spassky game in 1959. So now, years later, it's 2005. So we see, there's some more modern methods of dealing with this now. White is not trying to play e3 and making mistakes as we seen in the Lasker Simul, the first game we saw. But now everybody knows that white should fianchetto here. Knight g e7. This is, again, modern moves. One of the old time moves was bishop g4, for instance. So now we see knight g4, knight g e7. Idea is simply to pile up on this pawn right here. It's bishop g2, knight g6, queen a4. This keeps black from snatching this pawn right now because of the pin here. Bishop b4 check for Morozevich. Knight bd2. And castle. So we can see here that, again, the same ideas since 1900, right? The same idea since 1959 is the wedge creating basically a disturbance in the quality of white's position and his effort trying to develop his pieces here. Same ideas after all this time. So white now castles. And black plays a5. And again, this has the same ideas. Black wants to pick up this pawn and also hinder the ideas of a3 and b4. And what does this wedge pawn do? Hinder it. See how this knight is blocking this bishop, and this bishop is in turn blocking this rook. So with the time that it's going to take for white to develop, black is marshaling his forces to attack, and also win this e pawn here, basically destroying the white center. So there it is, a3. The bishop just simply returns to e7. And black has a wonderful position here. It's hard to think he's a pawn. He's actually a pawn down here, but he just has a nice position. You almost forget that he's a pawn down. There's so much pressure here. Grandmaster Kankin plays real logically. Rook d1. The rooks belong on open file. There's a pawn here, and he wants to apply more pressure to that pawn, right? So finally, the pawn drops on e5. So there it is. Knight c takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. So now we see that black has gotten his pawn back. It's knight f3, knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, and bishop f6. Interesting also is this move c5. But then there will be a little bit of weakness in b6 square and on b7 also. c5 is definitely interesting. Bishop f6, preserving the pawn here. c5 is an interesting move. Queen e7. This is a good move. It gets the, remember I always talk about the opposition, the pieces. This is good for white, having his rook here on d1 and black's queen on d8. So he does the right thing and vacates the premises. Gets out of there. And he does so with tempo. Bishop f4. And now here is a really good move, an impressive move, and a gutsy move by Morozevich. Is he plays g5, attacking the bishop, basically sending the bishop, to no man's land. The bishop is now in an awkward position because that bishop now is either going to have to block the rook on d1, right, coming here, or it's going to have to block the development of the rook on a1 by going back home. What's the price that black has to pay? Well, he's weakened his king side slightly. So that's why I say it's a gutsy move, because that's a weakness that's going to stay for the entire game. But white sensed the pressure building up on the queen side because white wants to attack these pawns, attack this complex right here. So g5, bishop d2, so he chooses to block the bishop on d1. And notice he's attacking this, but black is not concerned about this capture so much because his queen is in a bad spot here. c6. So blocks this pawn here, fixes this here as a weakness. And furthermore, remember how I say about dealing with the bishops, blocking the bishops. This, and combined with this pawn, help blockade against this bishop. So this bishop's biting on a bit of granite here. And now this bishop is free to develop. Queen c2, taking advantage of the weakened light squares, and at the same time defending this pawn here. a4, causing this pawn to be backward and also hindering the development of the white pieces and the white queen side. So now if this pawn moves, black can capture and passant and then have this weakness to pile up on. So he doesn't allow this connection to be made. There's e3. Now should black capture? He could capture. That's an option. But there's a better move here. Look at your pieces. Notice the queen and rook is right next to each other. How about if we could cheat, right? And we take this bishop and put him right there. That's the kind of move I like. So Morozevich develops a piece with a threat. And it's hard to get more than that. Now he's threatening just to play right there. Therefore, Kenkin plays rook to e1. And now he's threatening to just play e takes d4. And Morozevich comes up with a nice move here. Always tactically alert. He plays d3. So he says, here, take the pawn. He takes, but notice, undefended. Bishop takes b2. Rook a, b1. Rook fd8. So now the pieces come to life. Notice how Morozevich jettisoned the D pawn for the B pawn. After it's done its job, he gets rid of that pawn. He takes the B pawn, and now he takes over the open file, the only open file, with his rook. So now Queen C2, and that was a slick move because the queen was the only piece protecting this pawn on A3. So after Rook D8, Queen has to move, and he grabs that pawn with the additional threat here. Now what? Bishop C3. So white wants to occupy that long diagonal, of course. Give me that pawn. And now we see white is in a whole world of trouble. Bishop A1. And of course, there's some primitiveness going on right here. Neanderthal tactics is just lining up and mating. Rook D7. Rook ED1. Bishop takes. Morozevich plays B6. Just protecting the assets. Bishop F3. Bishop D5, because now it's consolidation time. Yeah, A3 is an interesting possibility. A3, but again, why go into complications? A3, and let's say bishop takes C6, and Rook D8. So that's pretty interesting right there. But why go into complications? This is natural. Just trade off everything. You're up, whole bunch of pawns. Queen F5, Queen E4, Queen F6, threatening mate, and there's a problem with that idea because after Queen takes B1 check, King G2, and there's just the simple D4 to top the thing off. And it's funny because I like how D4 was so important in the game. Because first you get D4 early in the game, right? Creating the wedge. And then you end the game off with with D4 again, creating another wedge at the end. And in this position, the move D4 demobilizes the opponent. In other words, it cuts off the communication here between the bishop and the queen, and just down material. There is no rescue. So for instance, if queen takes G5 check, then just queen G6. Bishop takes D4, then bishop takes D4. If E takes D4, then queen E4 check. So there's no rescue here. So that was the end of the little walkthrough of the Albin Counter Gambit, and I wanted to show it from the black perspective, because normally you show chess games and tutorials, you always show like white winning the game and stuff like that. But I wanted to show the this game through the various stages, and see the no name Lasker game, and then watch this video, and you can see that the opening is a good fun. It's a good fun opening to play if you like to play actively. And the only downside, besides being down a pawn, is that you can't always get to it. And that's another story in itself when it comes to having the time to prepare. You can't always get to the Albin Counter Gambit. And what do I mean by that? Is that the opponent has to play the Queen's Gambit. So, for instance, if he wants to play like this, a lot of players like to, play that, then you kind of like, got to go into the irregular lines, whatever, knight f6, e6, or what have you. But if you have the time to, look at some games in the Albin, it's pretty dynamic and fun opening to play, especially and short time controls. So if you're playing an opponent in game 30, game 15, in a tournament or something like that, don't be afraid to whip this baby out because it's just complicated enough to where you could definitely catch somebody off guard. Okay, so please like and subscribe, and I hope you learned something from that video, and we'll see you next time.